Before David Carter signed the final page, he looked straight at his wife and laughed. In front of attorneys, investors, and his own board of directors, he declared that Emily Brown had never built a single thing worth remembering. The room stayed silent as he ordered her to sign and disappear from both his company and his life. Emily lowered her eyes, said nothing, and calmly reached for the pen. No one noticed the quiet exchange between her and the company's oldest attorney. By the time the ink dried, David believed he had erased his wife forever. In truth, he had just surrendered everything he believed he owned. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. Share it in the comments. It's always fascinating to see how people from around the world come together for stories where truth, patience, and justice matter. And if these are the kinds of stories that stay with you long after they end, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next one. The rain had become part of Seattle's rhythm long before Emily Brown and David Carter ever imagined building a company together. It washed over the glass towers downtown, softened the sounds of traffic, and blurred the skyline into shades of gray that somehow inspired ambition instead of despair. Years later, when people spoke about Carter dynamics, they almost always spoke about David. His interviews appeared in business magazines. His speeches filled conference halls. His face became synonymous with innovation. Very few people ever asked who had been standing beside him before the cameras arrived. The answer had never bothered Emily Brown. She had never measured her worth by applause. Even in the earliest days, when the company occupied a cramped office above a struggling coffee shop, Emily preferred the desk tucked into the corner rather than the chair facing the entrance. While David pitched investors with infectious confidence, she refined budgets, revised contracts, organized research, and quietly corrected problems before anyone else realized they existed. She possessed a habit that many dismissed as unnecessary. She documented everything, every agreement, every meeting, every revision, every email, every handwritten note that changed an important decision. People joked that Emily trusted paper more than memory. She never argued. She simply filed another document. What no one realized was that discipline would one day become more valuable than every compliment David ever received. Back then, however, none of that seemed important. The company had only 4 employees. The furniture came from secondhand stores. The conference table had been assembled from 2 mismatched desks pushed together. David used to laugh about it. One day, he often said, "We'll look back and miss this place." Emily always smiled. She knew success had a way of changing memories. Sometimes it even changed people. David had not always been arrogant. When they first met, he was intelligent, determined, and remarkably willing to admit when someone else had a better idea. That willingness had drawn Emily toward him far more than his ambition ever had. She admired confidence. She distrusted pride. For years, the balance between those two qualities remained intact. Their marriage grew alongside their business. Long nights became ordinary. Weekends disappeared into spreadsheets, prototype testing, investor presentations, and endless discussions over takeout dinners that grew cold before either of them remembered to eat. Whenever exhaustion threatened to overwhelm David, Emily quietly reminded him why they had started. Whenever uncertainty crept into Emily's thoughts, David convinced her they could overcome another obstacle. They were partners in every meaningful sense, or so it seemed. The first major investment arrived during the company's 2nd year. The amount was large enough to transform everything. It was also large enough to expose them to serious legal and financial risks. That was when Jonathan Reed entered their lives. Jonathan had practiced corporate law for more than 3 decades. Unlike younger attorneys eager to impress clients with complicated language, Jonathan preferred simplicity. He believed that every contract revealed something about the character of the people signing it. He spent nearly 2 full days reviewing Carter Dynamics before asking Emily a question that surprised everyone. "If this company succeeds beyond your expectations," he asked gently, "how do you protect it from future emotional decisions?" David laughed. "We're married." Jonathan nodded politely. So are many people who eventually find themselves sitting across from each other in court. Silence settled across the conference room. Emily was the first to understand what he meant. Businesses often survived technological disruption. They rarely survived pride. Jonathan proposed an ownership structure unlike anything David had expected. Certain partnership rights would remain legally protected under carefully drafted agreements that could not be casually removed later, even if relationships changed. The structure complied fully with corporate law. It required complete trust at the beginning because it anticipated uncertainty in the future. David skimmed the explanation. Emily studied every page. She asked questions. She requested clarifications. She examined every clause until Jonathan finally smiled. "You read contracts the way engineers read blueprints." Emily answered quietly. "Both determine whether something stands or collapses." Jonathan never forgot that sentence. Neither did the documents he carefully prepared. When everything was complete, the agreements were signed, witnessed, notarized, and secured. Only 3 people fully understood every implication: Jonathan, Emily, and David. Years would pass before one of them forgot. Success accelerated faster than anyone predicted. The company's software attracted national attention. Investment rounds multiplied. New headquarters replaced the old office. Hundreds of employees joined. The modest startup evolved into a respected technology company, competing with industry leaders. Recognition followed naturally. Business magazines wanted interviews. Television programs invited David to discuss entrepreneurship. Conference organizers advertised his name across enormous digital screens. Emily rarely appeared beside him, not because she was excluded, because she preferred remaining where decisions actually happened. While David delivered keynote speeches, Emily reviewed operational reports. While photographers captured smiling executives, she examined compliance records. While investors praised quarterly growth, she verified whether every financial statement accurately reflected reality. She believed invisible work often mattered most. Unfortunately, invisible work was also the easiest to forget. Among those who forgot first was Linda Carter. David's mother had never openly approved of Emily. She considered her too quiet, too analytical, too unwilling to seek attention. Linda admired visible confidence. She measured success through applause, expensive clothing, luxury offices, and public recognition. Whenever she visited company headquarters, she saw David surrounded by executives, while Emily worked behind closed doors reviewing contracts or meeting with department managers. Linda drew the wrong conclusion. One afternoon, she remarked over lunch loud enough for several employees to hear, "David built an empire. Emily just enjoys living inside it." Several people exchanged uncomfortable glances. Emily happened to be walking past their table. She heard every word. She kept walking. Not because the comment failed to hurt, because she had learned years earlier that correcting assumptions rarely changed people determined to believe them. Later that afternoon, Megan Collins, the company's chief financial officer, knocked gently on Emily's office door. Megan had joined Carter Dynamics 5 years earlier after leaving a prestigious accounting firm. She respected numbers because numbers rarely lied. She also respected Emily. "I heard what happened," Megan said carefully. Emily continued organizing folders. "It doesn't matter." "It should." Emily smiled faintly. "Only if I need her approval." Megan hesitated before speaking again. I don't understand how you stay this calm. Emily placed another labeled folder into the cabinet. Documentation teaches patience. Megan looked puzzled. Emily continued. When people argue, memories become unreliable. Documents don't become emotional. It was an answer Megan would remember much later. By then, however, the consequences of those words had not yet begun. Across another floor of the building, David stood before a group of investors describing the company's future with absolute confidence. He truly believed every success belonged to him. Not because he intended to erase Emily, but because praise had gradually replaced perspective. The transformation had happened slowly enough that almost nobody noticed. Except Emily, except Jonathan, and perhaps somewhere beneath his growing confidence, David himself. The company continued moving toward greater success. Its foundations remained exactly where they had always been, hidden beneath years of growth, protected by signatures almost everyone had forgotten. Almost everyone. Success did not change Carter dynamics overnight. It arrived in quiet increments. A larger office, a second floor, another round of funding, a growing engineering team, national recognition, then international clients. Each achievement seemed deserved. Each celebration felt earned. Yet somewhere between those milestones, the balance that had once defined David Carter and Emily Brown began to shift so gradually that few people recognized it while it was happening. David noticed it least of all. Every interview reinforced the same story. The visionary founder, the brilliant CEO, the entrepreneur who transformed a simple idea into one of Seattle's fastest-growing technology companies. Journalists rarely asked who had built the systems that kept the company stable after investors arrived. They rarely wondered who reviewed thousands of pages of compliance documents before every acquisition. They rarely cared who stayed in the office after midnight, correcting financial inconsistencies before quarterly reports were submitted. Those responsibilities belonged to Emily. Invisible work rarely attracted headlines. She preferred it that way. Every morning she arrived before sunrise. She unlocked her office herself. She brewed coffee in the small machine she had brought from the company's original workspace years ago. Then she opened the leather notebook she carried everywhere. Its pages contained observations rather than opinions. Meeting times, decisions, names, dates, promises, corrections. If David suggested changing a strategy, Emily noted when the idea appeared, who approved it, and what assumptions supported it. If investors requested revisions, she documented every version. If attorneys amended language in a contract, she saved each draft instead of replacing the previous one. Some executives teased her about maintaining what they called a museum of paperwork. Emily only smiled. Museums preserved history. She believed businesses should do the same. One Monday morning, David walked into the executive conference room 15 minutes late. The room immediately became quieter. Department heads straightened in their chairs. Presentation screens lit up. Everyone waited for him to speak. David enjoyed that feeling more than he admitted. He greeted the executives with relaxed confidence before beginning another ambitious presentation about expanding into international markets. The plan was bold, perhaps too bold. Emily listened without interruption. When David finished, the room filled with enthusiastic applause. Only after everyone else had spoken did Emily raise a single question. What legal framework are we using for data compliance in Europe? The room fell silent. David hesitated. We'll figure that out. Emily nodded politely. Before signing, David forced a smile. Our legal team will handle it. Jonathan Reed, seated near the end of the table, quietly closed his notebook. We can, he said evenly. provided we're given enough time. Emily said nothing else. The meeting moved on. Afterward, several executives congratulated David on his vision. Almost no one remembered Emily's question. Jonathan did. So did Megan Collins. As Chief Financial Officer, Megan had developed a habit of watching people more carefully than spreadsheets. She noticed that Emily never tried to embarrass David. She asked questions only when necessary. Never dramatically, never emotionally, always factually. The difference mattered. David, however, had begun interpreting questions as challenges. That misunderstanding grew stronger every month. Outside the office, Linda Carter encouraged it without realizing how dangerous it would become. She visited David almost every Friday afternoon. Sometimes she brought lunch. Other times, she simply occupied the comfortable chair across from his desk while discussing company gossip. "I still don't understand why Emily keeps involving herself in executive decisions," Linda remarked one afternoon. David barely looked up from his laptop. "She's always been involved. But she's not the public face." "No. So why should she have influence?" David sighed. "She understands operations." Linda leaned forward. "Operations can be replaced." David remained silent. "Leadership can't." The sentence lingered longer than either of them realized. Linda continued, "People invest because they believe in you." David finally smiled. "I suppose that's true." She smiled back. "Then stop acting like you need permission from someone who never wanted the spotlight." David did not answer. He simply returned to his work. Yet the conversation settled quietly into his thoughts. Over the following weeks, subtle changes appeared. Emily stopped receiving invitations to certain strategy meetings until the last minute. Several presentations reached her desk only after decisions had already been made. David increasingly relied on executives who agreed quickly instead of colleagues who asked careful questions. None of the changes seemed dramatic. Together, they formed a pattern. Emily noticed. She documented it. One evening, long after most employees had gone home, Megan knocked softly on Emily's office door. Stacks of contracts covered the conference table. Color-coded folders lined the shelves. Emily looked up from her laptop. "You're still here." "So are you," Megan replied. Emily smiled. "I usually am." Megan hesitated. "Can I ask something personal?" Emily nodded. "Why don't you fight back?" Emily closed the document she had been reviewing. "What makes you think I'm fighting?" Megan frowned. "David keeps excluding you." "He isn't excluding me from the work. But he is excluding you from the recognition." Emily considered the question carefully. "Recognition isn't ownership." Megan waited. Emily continued quietly. "I learned years ago that people confuse visibility with importance." "And you don't?" Emily glanced toward the rain falling beyond her office window. "The foundation of a building is never visible." The conversation ended there. Megan walked away thoughtful. Emily reopened another contract. Outside, the city lights reflected across wet streets while traffic crawled through the evening rain. Inside Jonathan Reed's office, another conversation was taking place. David had arrived unexpectedly. "I want to simplify our shareholder agreements," David announced. Jonathan looked up from a thick file. "What do you mean by simplify?" "Some of these old documents are outdated." Jonathan removed his glasses. "Which documents?" "The original partnership agreements." Jonathan studied David for several long seconds before answering. "They're not outdated. They're overcomplicated. They were intentionally written that way." David shrugged. Then maybe it's time to rewrite them. Jonathan folded his hands. Have you read them recently? David laughed. I signed them years ago. That's not what I asked. David's smile faded slightly. I know what they say. Jonathan's voice remained calm. Do you? Silence settled between them. Jonathan opened a drawer and removed a thick blue binder. The cover showed a faded label, Founding Agreements. He placed it gently on the desk. I recommend reading every page before making changes. David glanced at the binder, but made no move to open it. I don't have time for legal history. Jonathan's expression revealed nothing. History has a habit of becoming the future. David stood. I'll let you know when we're ready. After he left, Jonathan remained seated for several minutes. His eyes rested on the unopened binder. He had spent decades practicing corporate law. He recognized warning signs long before clients did. Pride often arrived disguised as confidence, and pride rarely read contracts. Later that night, Emily received a brief email from Jonathan. No greeting, no unnecessary explanation. Only one sentence. Please confirm that your original records remain complete. Emily read it once. Then she walked to the fireproof cabinet built into the wall behind her desk. Using a small key attached to her notebook, she unlocked the cabinet. Inside were neatly organized binders labeled by year. Original bank transfers, founding agreements, board minutes, early investor correspondence. Every document had been preserved exactly as it had existed on the day it was created. She examined them carefully. Nothing was missing. She replied with only 4 words. Everything remains exactly intact. Jonathan received the email less than 2 minutes later. He nodded once before shutting down his computer. Outside his office window, Seattle disappeared beneath another curtain of rain. Inside 3 different buildings across the city, 3 people prepared for the same future without realizing how close it had become. David believed the past no longer mattered. Emily understood that it never truly disappeared. Jonathan knew that forgotten signatures often carried the greatest weight. None of them could yet see how quickly those 3 truths would collide. By the beginning of autumn, Carter Dynamics had become one of the most closely watched technology companies in the Pacific Northwest. Industry analysts predicted another year of record-breaking growth. Business magazines praised David Carter's leadership. Investment firms competed for opportunities to participate in the company's next expansion. Inside headquarters, however, the atmosphere had begun to change. Success brought pressure. Pressure revealed character, and character determined how people behaved when no cameras were present. David had become increasingly impatient with hesitation. He wanted faster decisions, larger acquisitions, more aggressive expansion. Every quarter had to outperform the previous one. Every announcement had to create headlines. Every meeting ended with another ambitious target. To many employees, that relentless confidence was inspiring. To Emily Brown, it was becoming dangerous, not because ambition itself was a problem, because ambition without careful structure eventually ignored the details that kept companies alive. On Monday morning, the executive floor buzzed with unusual excitement. A confidential meeting had been scheduled with representatives from one of the largest venture investment firms on the West Coast. Rumors spread quickly. Some believed the investment would exceed $300 million. Others whispered about international acquisitions. Nobody knew the exact numbers. Only the executive team had access to the proposal. Emily entered the boardroom carrying a thin leather portfolio. David was already standing beside the large digital display. He looked energized. "This," he announced with a confident smile, "is the biggest opportunity we've ever had." Slides illuminated the screen. projected growth, market expansion, European offices, artificial intelligence initiatives, acquisition targets. Every forecast promised extraordinary returns. Executives exchanged excited looks. Several board members nodded before David had even finished speaking. When the presentation ended, applause filled the room once again. David accepted it naturally. Then Charles Bennett slowly adjusted his glasses. Unlike many investors, Charles rarely reacted emotionally during meetings. He had spent 40 years investing in companies across the country. He had watched brilliant businesses collapse because leaders believed success made them immune to procedure. He folded his hands. "Before we move forward," he said calmly, "I'd like to review the company's ownership structure." The room became noticeably quieter. David smiled politely. "Our ownership hasn't changed." Charles returned the smile. "That's precisely why I'd like to review it." David gestured toward Jonathan Reed. "Our legal department has everything under control." Jonathan remained expressionless. "We maintain complete records." Charles nodded. "Excellent." He paused. "I'd still like an independent review." David's smile weakened slightly. "Is that really necessary?" Charles answered without hesitation. "For an investment of this size?" "Absolutely." No one spoke for several seconds. Emily quietly wrote another note inside her notebook. Date, time, request for ownership review before investment approval. David noticed her writing, but said nothing. The meeting continued. Afterward, executives gathered in small groups discussing expansion plans. David stood near the windows, speaking enthusiastically with several investors. Emily walked toward the elevator. She almost reached it before Megan Collins caught up with her. "Do you have a minute?" Emily nodded. They stepped into an empty conference room. Megan closed the door. "I've been reviewing some of our historical shareholder files." Emily listened carefully. "I found references to documents that aren't included in our current executive database." Emily's expression remained unchanged. "Which documents?" "Original ownership supplements." Emily waited. "They're referenced," Megan continued, "but the actual files aren't available digitally." "They wouldn't be." Megan looked surprised. "They're original legal documents." Emily answered quietly. "Jonathan insisted they remain in physical storage." "Have you seen them recently?" "Yes." Megan hesitated. "Should I be concerned?" Emily considered the question. "You should always be curious." The answer left Megan with more questions than before. Meanwhile, David walked into Jonathan Reed's office carrying the preliminary investment proposal. "This deal needs to move quickly." Jonathan accepted the folder. "I'll begin reviewing it. I'd like everything ready within 2 weeks." Jonathan flipped through several pages. "That depends." "On what?" "Whether every existing ownership agreement supports the transaction." David sighed impatiently. "We've already discussed this." Jonathan looked directly at him. "No, we haven't." He opened another file from his desk. "The investors are asking for verification because your original corporate structure is unusually detailed." David leaned back. "Then tell them everything is fine." "I can't." David frowned. "Why not?" "Because verification requires review." David rubbed his forehead. "This is becoming unnecessarily complicated." Jonathan closed the folder. "Complicated is discovering a problem after $300 million has changed hands." David stood. "There isn't going to be a problem." Jonathan remained seated. "I sincerely hope you're right." As David left, Jonathan watched the office door close before quietly reaching for the blue binder labeled Founding Agreements. He had reviewed those documents countless times over the years. Each review produced the same conclusion. The agreements remained legally sound. The hidden partnership provisions remained fully enforceable. Nothing had expired. Nothing had been amended. Nothing had been removed. Only memory had faded. Across the building, Emily sat alone, reviewing operational reports. Her office reflected her personality: neat, organized, practical. Family photographs occupied one small shelf. Most showed earlier years. David smiling beside her in the original office, both of them covered in dust while assembling furniture, celebrating their first employee, holding coffee cups after working through another night. Looking at those photographs, it became difficult to reconcile them with the man David had become. Emily closed the album. The past deserved respect. It should never become an excuse for ignoring the present. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. It was Olivia Chen, Director of Human Resources. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all." Olivia entered carrying several employee satisfaction reports. "We've noticed something." Emily gestured toward a chair. "Go ahead." "Executive departments are becoming divided." Emily remained silent. Olivia continued. "People feel they're choosing sides." Emily lowered her pen. "Between whom?" Olivia hesitated. "You and David." Emily looked genuinely surprised. "There aren't sides. Employees think there are." Olivia explained that some managers increasingly believed only David's opinions mattered. Others privately sought Emily's advice because her recommendations consistently anticipated future problems. The organization itself had begun reflecting the quiet distance between its two founders. Emily thanked Olivia for sharing the information. She made another note inside her notebook. Not because she intended to use it against anyone, because patterns mattered. Later that afternoon, Linda Carter arrived unexpectedly. She entered David's office without knocking. "I heard about the investors." David smiled. "It's huge. I knew you'd get here." She embraced her son proudly, then her expression changed. "I also heard Charles Bennett wants another ownership review." David rolled his eyes. "Lawyers and investors always want paperwork." Linda laughed dismissively. "That's because they don't know who's really responsible for this company." David smiled. "They will." Linda glanced toward the hallway. "Emily wasn't involved in today's presentation, was she?" "No." "Good." David looked briefly uncomfortable. "She handles operations." Linda waved away the explanation. "Operations aren't what people remember." Those words echoed something she had said months earlier. David no longer questioned them. As evening settled over Seattle, Charles Bennett remained alone inside the boardroom, reviewing financial summaries. He was impressed. Revenue growth exceeded expectations. Operational efficiency ranked among the best he had ever seen. Yet one observation continued bothering him. Every major internal improvement appeared connected to reports prepared by Emily Brown. Every major public announcement featured David Carter. The imbalance seemed unusual. Charles quietly made a note for the next board meeting: request complete historical governance review. He underlined the sentence once, not twice. He disliked exaggeration. But experience had taught him something valuable. When ownership structures became invisible, leadership often became dangerous. Outside rain struck the windows with steady persistence. Inside the headquarters, dozens of employees worked late, believing they were helping build the future. None of them realized the future would soon depend far less on innovation than on decisions made years earlier. Somewhere beneath thousands of digital files and polished executive presentations rested a handful of aging documents. Paper, ink, signatures, promises. Quietly waiting for the moment someone would finally be forced to read them again. The first time David Carter mentioned divorce, he did not raise his voice. He said it the way someone might announce a change in next week's meeting schedule. Calm, practical, almost detached. The words came late on a Thursday evening inside the penthouse apartment overlooking Elliott Bay. Rain traced slow lines across the floor-to-ceiling windows, while the lights of downtown Seattle shimmered in the distance. Emily Brown had just finished reviewing a supplier contract when David walked into the living room carrying a glass of sparkling water. Neither of them had touched dinner. That had become increasingly common. "We need to talk," David said. Emily closed her laptop without asking what the conversation would be about. She had sensed it approaching for months. David remained standing instead of sitting across from her. "I don't think this marriage works anymore." The room stayed quiet. Not because Emily was shocked, because she wanted to hear everything before responding. David continued. "We've become different people." Emily looked at him steadily. "When did you decide that—" He hesitated. "I've been thinking about it for a while." She nodded once. "Go on." David seemed almost irritated by her composure. "I don't want this to become ugly. It doesn't have to. I'd like us to handle everything professionally." Emily answered with the same calm tone. "I agree." For a brief moment, David appeared uncertain. Perhaps he had expected anger, tears, accusations. Instead, Emily simply waited. Silence often encouraged people to reveal more than arguments ever could. David finally sat down. "There are also company matters we need to resolve." Emily had expected that sentence. She folded her hands. "What company matters? I think it's time to separate your involvement." Emily did not interrupt. "You've stepped back from leadership anyway. I've stepped back from publicity." David frowned slightly. "The difference isn't significant." Emily said nothing. David continued. "I'll make sure you're financially comfortable." Comfortable. The word lingered in the room. Not respected, not acknowledged. Comfortable. As though years of partnership could be reduced to a generous financial arrangement. Emily noticed the wording. She stored it quietly in her memory. "I appreciate your concern," she said. David relaxed slightly, believing the difficult part of the conversation had passed. "I've already spoken with Jonathan about beginning the legal process." Emily's expression did not change. "When?" "Earlier this week." She nodded. "And?" "He'll prepare the paperwork." Emily looked toward the rain outside. "Good." David blinked. "Good. If we're going to do this, we should do it correctly." Her answer surprised him. "So, you're not going to fight me?" Emily looked back at him. What would that accomplish? David searched her face for signs of resentment. He found none, only exhaustion. For the first time in years, he wondered whether he truly understood the woman sitting across from him. The thought disappeared almost as quickly as it arrived. "I'd like the process to move quickly," he said. "It can. And I'd prefer if you stepped away from executive decisions immediately." Emily considered his request. "I'm willing to reduce my daily responsibilities during the transition." David smiled faintly. "I think that's best." Emily asked one final question. "Will every decision follow the existing legal agreements?" David answered confidently. "Of course," she nodded. "Then I have no objection." The conversation ended less than 30 minutes after it had begun. There were no raised voices, no broken dishes, no dramatic departures. Only two people sitting in a room that suddenly felt much larger than before. After David went upstairs, Emily remained in the living room. She opened the leather notebook she carried almost everywhere. Under the day's date, she wrote only 4 lines. David requested divorce, requested removal from company operations, confirmed legal process through Jonathan, confirmed existing agreements remain applicable. Nothing else. No personal reflections, no emotional commentary. Facts. She closed the notebook. Across town, Jonathan Reed was still awake in his office. The phone rang shortly after 10. He recognized the caller immediately. Emily. Good evening, Jonathan. I expected you might call. I won't take much of your time. Jonathan leaned back in his chair. How did the conversation go? As expected. And David? He wants everything handled quickly. Jonathan closed his eyes for a brief moment. I was afraid of that. Emily remained silent. He still hasn't reviewed the founding agreements, Jonathan continued. I know. I reminded him again yesterday. I assumed you would. Jonathan sighed quietly. There are moments when attorneys feel completely powerless. Emily answered gently. You've done your job. Not yet. There was another pause. Finally, Jonathan asked, do you still have every original record? Every one. Bank transfers? Yes. Partnership correspondence? Yes. Signed exhibits? Yes. Board minutes? All preserved. Jonathan looked toward the blue binder resting on the corner of his desk. Good. Emily asked softly. Do you think he'll read them before signing? Jonathan took longer to answer than usual. I hope so. Neither of them truly believed it. The following morning, David arrived at headquarters earlier than usual. His schedule was packed. Investor conference, executive strategy meeting, media interview, lunch with Charles Bennett, budget review. His assistant placed a stack of legal documents beside his coffee. Jonathan had attached several sticky notes requesting review before the following week's meeting. David glanced at the first page. The packet appeared thick. Too thick. He pushed it aside. I'll read it this weekend. His assistant nodded. She had heard similar promises before. By noon, David met Charles Bennett in a quiet private dining room overlooking Lake Union. Charles preferred business lunches without distractions. No photographers, no assistants, no presentations, only conversation. After discussing market conditions, Charles placed his napkin neatly beside his plate. I understand there are changes happening personally. David offered a polite smile. News travels quickly. It usually does. David shrugged. Emily and I have decided to divorce. Charles remained thoughtful. I'm sorry to hear that. It's for the best. Charles did not challenge the statement. Instead, he asked another question. Will it affect the company's ownership? David answered almost immediately. No. Charles tilted his head slightly. You're certain? Completely. Charles stirred his coffee slowly. I'd still advise reviewing every founding agreement. David laughed softly. Jonathan says the same thing. Perhaps there's a reason. David waved dismissively. The structure is straightforward. Charles did not respond immediately. Experience had taught him that confidence often sounded loudest immediately before mistakes. Finally, he said, straightforward agreements rarely require hundreds of pages. David smiled politely. I appreciate the advice. Charles recognized the conversation had reached its limit. He changed the subject. Later that afternoon, Megan Collins received a request from Jonathan. He asked her to retrieve every historical financial record connected to the company's first investment round. She looked surprised. Everything. Everything. That's nearly 12 years of archives. Jonathan nodded. I know. Megan hesitated. Is something wrong? Jonathan chose his words carefully. Nothing is wrong. Yet. The single word unsettled her. She spent the rest of the afternoon accessing archived servers, physical storage inventories, and old banking records. The deeper she searched, the more frequently Emily Brown's name appeared. Internal authorizations, transfer confirmations, early operating capital, strategic funding approvals. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Emily's involvement reached far beyond administrative work. Much farther. Meanwhile, Linda Carter arrived unexpectedly at headquarters, carrying expensive pastries for David's executive team. She entered his office smiling. I heard everything. David looked up. So, Jonathan told you? No. You did. Linda embraced him. You've carried this marriage long enough. David said nothing. Linda continued confidently. Once the divorce is finished, you can finally run the company without unnecessary complications. David stared through the office windows toward the rainy skyline. For reasons he couldn't explain, Jonathan's repeated warnings echoed briefly in his thoughts. Read the agreements. Review the documents. Understand what you're signing. He pushed the thoughts aside. He had built the company. He knew what belonged to him. Or at least, he believed he did. Across the building, Emily quietly finished organizing another set of records before locking them inside the fireproof cabinet. She rested her hand on the cabinet door for a brief moment. Not because she feared what was coming, because she understood something David no longer did. The most important decisions in life were rarely made on the day someone signed a document. They were made years earlier. The signatures merely revealed them. The following Monday began with an unusual request. At exactly 8 o'clock, Jonathan Reed sent identical calendar invitations to Emily Brown, Megan Collins, and the company's records manager, Thomas Miller. The subject line contained only 3 words: historical file review. No explanation followed. Within minutes, the 4 of them gathered in the secured records archive beneath Carter Dynamics headquarters. Unlike the sleek executive floor with its glass walls and polished conference rooms, the archive looked almost forgotten. Steel shelving stretched across the room. Fireproof cabinets stood in carefully numbered rows. Climate control units hummed softly to preserve paper records dating back to the company's earliest days. Jonathan looked around before speaking. Everything we do today stays confidential. Everyone nodded. Thomas unlocked the first cabinet. Inside were dozens of archival boxes labeled by year. Jonathan removed a pair of white cotton gloves before lifting the oldest binder. Founding agreements. The cover showed signs of age, but every page inside remained perfectly preserved. Emily watched silently. She had not opened that binder in years. She had never needed to. Jonathan laid several documents across the conference table. We're verifying completeness. Megan frowned slightly. Not authenticity. Jonathan smiled faintly. The authenticity has never been questioned. His answer only deepened her curiosity. One by one, Thomas retrieved additional files. Original articles of incorporation, early shareholder agreements, capital contribution schedules, meeting minutes, bank confirmations. Every document carried signatures that had been witnessed, notarized, and properly archived. Jonathan compared each page against an inventory checklist. Nothing appeared missing. Nothing appeared altered. After nearly 2 hours, Megan finally asked the question that had been bothering her. Why now? Jonathan looked at Emily before answering. Because important decisions are about to be made. And important decisions deserve complete records. Megan accepted the explanation, though she sensed there was much more Jonathan had deliberately chosen not to reveal. When the review finished, Jonathan separated several folders from the rest. I'll keep these in my custody. Thomas signed the transfer log. Emily quietly added her own signature as a witness. The legal chain of possession remained intact. Jonathan insisted upon that detail. Small procedures prevented enormous arguments later. Upstairs, David Carter had no idea the archive review had taken place. His attention rested entirely on the upcoming investment negotiations. Representatives from 3 venture firms were scheduled to arrive later that week. The proposed funding could transform Carter Dynamics into a global competitor. Everything depended on speed. David repeated that word constantly. We have to move quickly. We can't slow down. Time is our biggest asset. His executives nodded. No one wanted to appear hesitant. During the strategy meeting, Megan entered carrying several financial reports. She distributed copies around the table before taking her seat. David began outlining the timeline. We'll finalize negotiations within 10 business days. One executive raised a concern. What about the ownership verification requested by Charles Bennett? David answered immediately. Jonathan is handling it. Another executive asked, should we review the original agreements before closing? David shook his head. They've already been reviewed years ago. Across the table, Megan lowered her eyes to the reports in front of her. She remembered the archive. She remembered the thickness of the founding documents. Most of all, she remembered how carefully Jonathan had protected them. Something about the situation still felt incomplete. She glanced briefly toward Emily. Emily simply listened. She neither supported nor challenged David's decision. She merely wrote another line inside her notebook. Meeting concluded. Ownership review deferred by CEO. No emotion, only facts. After the meeting ended, Charles Bennett requested a private conversation with Jonathan. They met inside Jonathan's office overlooking the waterfront. Charles closed the door behind him. I have a concern. Jonathan nodded. I assumed you might. Charles sat down. David seems determined to move faster than his paperwork. Jonathan allowed himself the smallest smile. That's an accurate observation. Charles leaned forward. I've invested in more than 80 companies. Jonathan remained silent. The dangerous ones weren't led by dishonest people. He paused. They were led by people who stopped reading. Jonathan looked toward the blue binder resting on his bookshelf. I couldn't agree more. Charles followed his gaze. That's the file, isn't it? Jonathan answered carefully. It contains the company's foundation. Charles asked quietly, has David reviewed it? Jonathan did not answer immediately. Finally, he said, I've asked him several times. Charles understood enough. Neither man needed additional explanation. Later that afternoon, Emily returned to her office and found Olivia Chen waiting outside. Olivia held a folder filled with employee surveys. I hope this isn't a bad time. Emily invited her inside. What can I do for you? Olivia placed the folder on the desk. I've completed another workplace culture assessment. Emily opened the report. Several comments immediately caught her attention. Leadership communication has become inconsistent. Departments receive conflicting instructions. Decision-making depends too heavily on one person. Operational concerns aren't reaching executive leadership. Emily read every page without interruption. Finally, she asked, how many employees participated? nearly 70%. Emily closed the folder gently. "Thank you." Olivia hesitated. "Should we discuss this with David?" Emily considered the question. "Yes." "When?" "When the report is finalized." "It already is." Emily smiled faintly. "Then we'll present it through the proper process. Not privately, not emotionally, not as criticism, only through procedure." Olivia nodded. That was exactly how Emily handled every difficult situation. Facts first, process second, emotion last. Sometimes, not at all. Across the city, Linda Carter met several longtime friends for lunch at an exclusive social club. The conversation inevitably turned toward David's company. "I hear another investment is coming." Linda smiled proudly. "It's bigger than the last one." "What about Emily?" Linda dismissed the question with a wave of her hand. "The divorce is almost settled. So she'll leave the business. She never really belonged there." The women accepted the statement without questioning it. Linda genuinely believed it. She had repeated the idea so often that it no longer felt like an opinion. It had become certainty. Unfortunately, certainty built upon incomplete information rarely survived contact with reality. Back at headquarters, Jonathan received an email from David. "Need final divorce documents prepared as soon as possible. Include complete business separation." Jonathan stared at the screen for several moments. Then he opened a new message. "Before I prepare final execution copies, I strongly recommend a full review meeting regarding the original corporate agreements and shareholder provisions. This review is in your best legal interest." He pressed send. Less than 10 minutes later, David replied, "No need. Prepare the documents." Jonathan read the message twice. Then he printed it. Without writing a single comment, he placed the email inside the blue binder. Every attorney developed habits over the course of a career. Jonathan's habit was preserving evidence that advice had been given. Clients often forgot warnings. Paper rarely did. Near sunset, Megan stopped by Emily's office once more. She appeared thoughtful. "I've been looking through those early financial records." Emily looked up from her work. "They're interesting. They're revealing." Emily waited. Megan chose her words carefully. "I don't think many people understand how much of the company was built through your planning." Emily smiled politely. "Companies are built by teams." "Yes. But history should still be accurate." Emily closed another folder. "It usually is. Eventually." Megan studied her for a moment. "You're expecting something?" Emily looked out the window, where rain had begun falling once again. "I'm expecting people to make their own decisions." "And if they're the wrong ones," Emily answered quietly, "then they'll belong to the people who made them." That evening, David remained alone in the executive suite long after everyone else had left. His desk was covered with presentations, investment projections, and expansion schedules. Among them sat a thick envelope from Jonathan. Inside were copies of the founding agreements Jonathan had once again recommended reviewing. David picked up the envelope. He weighed it in his hand. Then he placed it unopened into his briefcase. "I'll read it tomorrow," he murmured. Outside the windows, Seattle's lights reflected across the dark water. Inside the briefcase, hundreds of pages waited patiently. They had waited for more than a decade. They could wait one more night. But not much longer. Friday arrived with unusually clear skies. For the first time in nearly 2 weeks, sunlight reflected from the glass facade of Carter Dynamics headquarters instead of rain. Employees noticed the change immediately. The brighter weather seemed to lift spirits throughout the building. Only the executive floor remained tense. At 9 o'clock, sharp Jonathan Reed stood alone inside the main boardroom, arranging folders around the polished walnut conference table. Each place had been carefully prepared. A copy of the divorce settlement, a copy of the corporate separation agreement, supporting exhibits, signature tabs, witness acknowledgments, corporate resolutions. Jonathan checked every page twice. Not because he expected mistakes, because today's documents would change lives. At the opposite end of the table, the company's general counsel, Allison Parker, quietly reviewed the witness certifications. She had worked alongside Jonathan for almost 15 years. Even she sensed something unusual. "You've never been this careful." Jonathan didn't look up. "I've never needed to be." Allison watched him organize the final stack. "You're expecting trouble." Jonathan answered without hesitation. "I'm expecting consequences." Before she could ask another question, the boardroom doors opened. David Carter entered first. He wore a tailored navy suit and carried himself with the confidence of someone convinced the day would finally remove the last obstacle standing between him and complete control of his company. Behind him walked Linda Carter. Although she had no formal role in the proceedings, David had insisted she attend as a family representative. Linda surveyed the room with obvious satisfaction. Her eyes briefly settled on the documents. "So this is finally happening." David smiled. "It should have happened months ago." Jonathan acknowledged them politely. "Good morning." David nodded. "Are we ready?" "We're waiting for the remaining participants." One by one they arrived. Charles Bennett entered carrying only a leather portfolio. He greeted everyone courteously before choosing a seat near the center of the table. Megan Collins followed with several financial binders requested by Jonathan. 2 additional board members took their places. Finally, Emily Brown walked into the room. She wore a simple charcoal gray suit. No expensive jewelry, no dramatic entrance. Only the same leather notebook she had carried for years. Several people instinctively looked toward her. She greeted everyone with quiet professionalism before sitting across from David. Neither of them spoke. The silence between them felt older than the marriage itself. Jonathan waited until everyone had settled. Then he addressed the room. "Today's meeting concerns 2 separate legal matters." He paused. The dissolution of the marriage between David Carter and Emily Brown. Another brief pause. And the execution of related corporate documentation. David leaned back comfortably. "Let's begin." Jonathan looked directly at him. "Before any signatures are placed, I'm required to ask one final question." David sighed. Jonathan continued. "Have all parties reviewed every document they intend to sign today?" Emily answered first. "Yes." Jonathan nodded. "Thank you." He turned toward David. "Mr. Carter?" David glanced at the stack. "I've reviewed enough." Jonathan remained still. "My question wasn't whether you've reviewed enough." David smiled impatiently. "I understand what I'm signing." Jonathan asked again. "Have you read every document?" A few seconds passed. "No." The admission echoed softly through the room. Jonathan spoke carefully. "I strongly recommend postponing today's execution until you've completed that review." David laughed. "Jonathan." His tone carried more irritation than amusement. "We've discussed this repeatedly." "We have. And I'm telling you, there's no need." Jonathan folded his hands. "My professional recommendation remains unchanged." David looked around the room. "Does anyone else believe we need another delay?" No one answered immediately. Charles Bennett finally spoke. I believe reading legal agreements before signing them is generally wise. David smiled politely. Noted. Then he looked toward Emily. You've read everything. Yes. And you're satisfied, Emily answered calmly. I understand the documents presented to me. Linda couldn't remain silent. Of course she is. Several heads turned toward her. Linda continued. This agreement is far more generous than she deserves. Emily didn't react. David didn't correct his mother. Jonathan simply wrote a short note beside the meeting minutes. At precisely 9:42 a.m., the formal proceedings began. Jonathan summarized each section one at a time. Marital property, financial accounts, real estate, corporate governance, board acknowledgments, supporting exhibits. Whenever he finished explaining a section, he paused. Any questions? Emily quietly answered when clarification was requested. David repeatedly responded with the same phrase. No. The meeting progressed slowly, almost deliberately. Every signature page carried legal significance. Every acknowledgement referenced earlier agreements. Every attachment connected to documents executed years before. David barely glanced at them. He signed where indicated, initialed where tabs appeared, turned pages almost automatically. Across the table, Emily carefully read every page before placing her initials beside each paragraph. Megan couldn't help noticing the contrast. David signed with confidence. Emily signed with certainty. The difference was subtle. It mattered enormously. An hour later, Jonathan reached the final packet. He looked at David one last time. This section references the original founding agreements. David picked up the pen. Jonathan continued. The provisions incorporated here remain legally binding. David tapped the pen lightly against the paper. I know. Jonathan didn't move the documents. Do you wish to review them before execution? No. Jonathan looked directly into David's eyes. As your attorney, I strongly advise that you do. David's patience finally disappeared. He placed both hands on the table. For months, he said loudly, I've listened to endless warnings about paperwork that changes absolutely nothing. The room fell silent. He pointed toward Emily. She walked away from this company years ago. Emily remained motionless. David continued. Everyone here knows who built Carter Dynamics. No one answered. His voice grew sharper. I carried this business. Still silence. I stood in front of investors. Another pause. I created every opportunity this company has. Charles lowered his eyes. Megan remained perfectly still. Jonathan allowed David to continue without interruption. David looked directly at Emily. And now we're pretending these documents somehow make us equals? Emily met his gaze calmly. I've never asked anyone to pretend. The sentence contained neither anger nor accusation, only truth. David gave a short, dismissive laugh. You've always hidden behind paperwork. Emily answered quietly. I've always respected it. Linda leaned forward. David, don't waste another minute. She gestured impatiently toward the documents. Sign them. Jonathan spoke once more. For the record. Everyone looked toward him. I again advise postponement until every document has been fully reviewed. David picked up the pen. I decline that recommendation. Jonathan looked at Allison Parker. She recorded the statement word for word. David signed the first page, then the second, then the third. Each signature appeared larger than the last. He barely slowed. Initial. Turn, sign, turn, initial, sign. Page after page disappeared beneath fresh ink. Emily watched quietly. She neither encouraged nor interrupted. When David finished the final signature, he placed the pen on the table with obvious satisfaction. There. He leaned back. Done. Jonathan carefully gathered the documents, not immediately, slowly, methodically. He verified every signature, every initial, every witness acknowledgement, every execution date. Then he placed the final page in front of Emily. She read it one final time. The room remained completely silent. No one moved. No one reached for a phone. Even Linda stopped smiling. Emily uncapped her pen. Without hesitation, she signed. Jonathan accepted the completed page. He closed the folder. The sound echoed softly through the boardroom. A simple click. Paper meeting paper. Nothing more. Yet several people instinctively held their breath, because Jonathan did not place the folder into his briefcase. Instead, he stood, very slowly. He rested both hands on the conference table, looked around the room, then said 7 calm words that instantly erased every trace of confidence from David Carter's face. Before anyone leaves, there is one legal matter we must address. No one reached for the door. The boardroom remained perfectly still after Jonathan Reed's quiet announcement. Before anyone leaves, he repeated, there is one legal matter we must address. The words themselves sounded ordinary. His tone did not. David Carter frowned. I thought we were finished. Jonathan remained standing. We've completed the execution of the documents. He rested one hand on the closed folder. We have not completed their legal interpretation. Linda Carter gave a short laugh. What does that even mean? Jonathan looked toward Allison Parker. As recording secretary, please confirm that every executed document has been witnessed and certified. Allison reviewed the signature pages one last time. Confirmed. Jonathan nodded. Thank you. He turned back toward the room. The documents signed today activate several provisions contained within the company's original founding agreements. David leaned back in his chair. You're talking about paperwork from 12 years ago. I'm talking about contracts that remain legally enforceable today. David folded his arms. And Jonathan opened the blue binder that had rested beside him throughout the meeting. Most people in the room had never seen it before. Its cover had faded with age. The corners showed years of careful handling. Inside, however, every page appeared pristine. Charles Bennett recognized it immediately. So that's the original archive. Jonathan inclined his head. It is. Linda looked confused. Why are we looking at old files? Jonathan answered calmly. Because the documents signed this morning expressly incorporate these agreements by reference. He carefully removed a notarized contract and placed it in the center of the table. This is the original Strategic Partnership Protection Agreement. David barely glanced at it. I signed dozens of documents when we started the company. Jonathan nodded. You did. And you also agreed that certain ownership rights would survive future changes in personal relationships, executive titles, and operational responsibilities. David shrugged. I don't remember the wording. Jonathan's expression remained composed. The wording remembers itself. Silence settled over the room. Jonathan adjusted the document so everyone could see the highlighted section. He did not dramatize the moment. He simply began reading. Pursuant to Section 7. His voice remained steady. The protected strategic partner shall retain all founding rights unless voluntarily relinquished through a separately executed waiver satisfying the conditions outlined herein. He looked up. No such waiver has ever been executed. David frowned. What protected strategic partner? Jonathan turned another page. The agreement defines that individual by name. He slid the document toward David. For the record, would you please read the highlighted line aloud? David looked irritated. I'm not playing games. Charles spoke quietly. Read it. David sighed heavily. He picked up the paper. His eyes scanned the paragraph, then stopped. For the first time that morning, genuine uncertainty crossed his face. He read more slowly. The protected strategic partner. His voice weakened almost imperceptibly. Shall be. He stopped. Jonathan waited. David continued. Emily Brown. The room fell completely silent. Linda laughed nervously. That can't be right. No one answered her. David looked up. This doesn't mean anything. Jonathan calmly reached for another document. It means exactly what it says. He placed a second agreement beside the first. This amendment was executed 3 months after incorporation. Another notarized signature. Another witness certification. Another reference to the same protected partnership. Jonathan continued. The language was reaffirmed during your Series A investment. A third document appeared, and again during your second institutional funding round. A fourth, and once more before international expansion. A fifth. Each document referenced the previous one. Each carried David's signature. Each carried Emily's signature. Each had been notarized. Each had been properly archived. David stared at the growing stack of papers. I don't remember this. Jonathan answered softly. Memory is not the legal standard. Linda leaned toward her son. Tell him those documents are outdated. Jonathan looked at her politely. They are not. They're old. Age and validity are different concepts. Charles Bennett finally spoke. I reviewed the incorporation index before investing. Jonathan nodded. You did. I noticed unusual cross-references. You did. Charles leaned back thoughtfully. I assumed there was a strategic reason. There was. David looked between the two men. What strategic reason? Jonathan folded his hands. 12 years ago, your company was vulnerable. He spoke not only to David, but to everyone present. You had limited capital, minimal assets, no established reputation. If something had happened to the marriage, he paused, or to either founder, the company could have collapsed. Emily remained silent. Jonathan continued. The solution was to separate public leadership from protected ownership. Linda shook her head. This is ridiculous. Jonathan calmly opened another folder. No. It's corporate law. Megan Collins, who had remained quiet throughout the meeting, slowly opened one of her financial binders. I have a question. Jonathan nodded. The original capital contribution schedules. He looked toward her. Are they connected? They are. Megan removed several archived spreadsheets. She compared dates, wire transfers, investment receipts, operating capital. Everything aligned. She looked at Emily, then at David, then back at Jonathan. The initial bridge financing, Jonathan waited, came through accounts authorized by Emily. Correct. The emergency payroll funding during year 1, also correct. The reserve capital required before the Series A investment, Jonathan nodded again. Correct. Megan closed the binder carefully. Every historical record supports these agreements. David stared at her. You knew, she answered honestly. I suspected there was more than I understood. I confirmed nothing until today. David looked toward Emily. You never told anyone. Emily met his eyes. You signed confidentiality provisions. David frowned. So did you. Yes. Then why? Emily answered quietly. Because agreement's a matter. Her voice remained free of triumph. She wasn't revealing a secret to embarrass him. She was acknowledging a fact that had existed all along. David stood abruptly. This is absurd. He pushed his chair backward. I built this company. Jonathan didn't argue. No one disputes your contribution. David pointed toward Emily. She wasn't running investor meetings. No. She wasn't giving interviews. No. She wasn't negotiating acquisitions. Jonathan answered each statement calmly. No. David spread his hands. Then how can she possibly? Jonathan interrupted gently. Because ownership and visibility are not the same thing. The sentence landed with unexpected weight. Charles slowly nodded. That's true. David looked toward him. You're taking their side, Charles answered without emotion. I'm taking the side of signed agreements. Linda's face reddened. There has to be a mistake. Jonathan looked directly at her. There have been 3 independent legal audits over 12 years. Everyone reached the same conclusion. Allison Parker added quietly, I reviewed the execution records this morning. They're complete. David sat back down, not because he accepted what he was hearing. Because his legs suddenly felt unsteady. His eyes remained fixed on the contracts spread across the table. Each signature belonged to him. Each page carried dates he recognized. Each notarization had been properly witnessed. There was no obvious flaw, no missing page, no forged signature. Nothing. He whispered almost to himself, I should have read them. No one answered. Jonathan slowly closed the blue binder. I advised you to. More silence. Then he opened one final envelope. This morning's execution created another legal consequence. David looked up sharply. What consequence? Jonathan slid the freshly signed corporate separation agreement toward Allison. She verified the execution, stamped the certification page, returned it. Jonathan looked around the room. The provisions protecting Emily Brown as the company's hidden partner. He paused deliberately. They have now been formally reaffirmed by today's execution. Charles exhaled slowly. Megan lowered her eyes. Even Allison stopped writing. David stared at Jonathan in disbelief. What exactly does that mean? Jonathan answered with the same calm precision he had maintained all morning. It means the ownership structure you believe no longer existed is now fully confirmed under both the original agreements and the documents you voluntarily signed less than an hour ago. David's face lost its color. Across the table, Emily quietly closed her notebook. She had not argued. She had not interrupted. She had not defended herself once. The documents had spoken for her. And they were only beginning. No one spoke for nearly half a minute. The silence inside the boardroom no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt judicial. Like the pause that followed sworn testimony before the next piece of evidence entered the record. David Carter remained seated staring at the documents spread across the polished conference table. He had signed every one of them, some more than a decade earlier, others less than an hour ago. For years, he had assumed the papers represented routine legal formalities. Now they seemed to belong to someone else's life. Final and swelly, he looked toward Jonathan Reed. There has to be another interpretation. Jonathan answered gently. There have already been 3 independent legal interpretations over the years. David shook his head. I mean, another one. Jonathan understood the difference. David wasn't asking for legal analysis. He was asking for escape. "There isn't." Linda Carter leaned forward. "This can't end here." Jonathan turned toward her. "It doesn't." He carefully opened another folder. The ownership agreements established status. He placed several additional documents beside the existing contracts. These established performance. David frowned. "What performance?" Jonathan looked toward Emily. "Mrs. Brown, with your permission." Emily nodded once. "Proceed." Jonathan removed a stack of printed emails bound with numbered exhibit tabs. Each page had been authenticated and certified months before as part of routine corporate record retention. He handed copies to everyone present. David accepted his reluctantly. The subject line on the first page immediately caught his attention. Operational Risk Assessment, European Expansion. The date was almost 4 years old. Jonathan spoke quietly. This email was sent by Emily before the company entered the European market. David scanned the first paragraph. Emily had outlined 6 potential regulatory risks. Each concern included proposed solutions. At the bottom of the page appeared David's response. "Good points. Implement everything before launch." David frowned. "I remember the expansion." Jonathan nodded. "Please continue reading." The following pages contained implementation reports, compliance schedules, budget revisions, legal approvals. Every recommendation had eventually become company policy. Charles Bennett looked up from the documents. "This reduced our exposure significantly." Jonathan nodded. "It did." Megan quietly added, "Our compliance costs were actually lower because these issues were addressed early." David turned another page, another email, another recommendation. This one concerned cybersecurity insurance. Emily had recommended increasing coverage nearly 2 years before a series of high-profile attacks affected technology companies nationwide. David had approved the recommendation. The company avoided millions of dollars in losses. Another page. Supply chain diversification. Another. Cash reserve requirements. Another. Employee retention planning. Every recommendation followed the same pattern. Emily identified the risk. David approved the solution. The company benefited. David slowly lowered the papers. "I never realized." Jonathan completed the sentence. "How consistently her work protected the company." Linda crossed her arms. "She was doing her job." Jonathan nodded. "Yes." So we now continue examining what that job actually included." He opened another evidence folder. Inside were board meeting minutes dating back nearly 10 years. Each document had been signed by attending directors. Jonathan selected one meeting in particular. This meeting occurred shortly before Carter Dynamics secured its largest institutional investment. Charles immediately recognized the date. "I remember this." Jonathan smiled slightly. "I'm sure you do." He handed everyone another copy. David read the minutes carefully. Discussion item 3. Emergency capital planning. Recommendation submitted by Emily Brown. Unanimously approved. He looked toward Megan. "You were here." She nodded. "I had just joined the company." "I don't remember this discussion." Megan answered honestly. "You left the room briefly to take a call from investors." David searched his memory. Slowly, fragments returned. The phone call, the delayed flight, the investors waiting overseas, Emily continuing the meeting while he stepped outside. He had forgotten. The minutes had not. Jonathan spoke softly. "Corporate records preserve participation regardless of memory." David remained silent. Jonathan placed another document before him. bank transfer confirmations, original operating account statements, capital contribution schedules. Each transfer had been verified by the company's original financial institution. Megan examined them carefully. The first emergency payroll transfer, she looked at Emily, came from your personal investment account. Emily nodded once. David looked stunned. I thought... He stopped. Emily waited patiently. I thought that money came from our bridge financing. Emily answered calmly. It arrived 3 weeks later. David stared at the documents. The dates proved her statement. Employees had been paid before the bridge financing closed. Someone had carried the company through those 3 weeks. He whispered, You never told me. Emily answered quietly, You were negotiating with investors. So, you already had enough pressure. The simplicity of the answer struck everyone in the room. No drama, no accusation, just a memory. Jonathan allowed the silence to settle before introducing another exhibit. This recording was made during a board meeting. David looked up immediately. A recording, Jonathan nodded. The meeting notice informed every attendee that proceedings would be recorded for corporate governance purposes. Allison confirmed it. That has been company policy for years. Jonathan pressed a button on a small digital recorder. The room filled with voices recorded nearly 6 years earlier. David's voice, Charles, several directors, Emily. The discussion centered on whether Carter Dynamics should accept a risky acquisition proposal. Many executives favored immediate expansion. Emily argued for caution. She presented financial models predicting hidden liabilities. Several people challenged her conclusions. Then David's recorded voice interrupted. I trust Emily's judgment. The recording continued. We reject the acquisition. Jonathan stopped playback. Charles looked around the room. 3 years later, that company declared bankruptcy. Megan nodded. We would have inherited every debt. David closed his eyes briefly. He remembered the meeting now, not clearly, but enough. He remembered trusting Emily instinctively. Long before praise had convinced him, he no longer needed her judgment. Jonathan spoke again. This isn't about proving that Emily contributed. No reasonable person disputes that. He paused. It's about establishing the nature of those contributions. Charles folded his hands. They weren't administrative. No. They were strategic. Yes. David slowly leaned back. The realization came piece by piece. He had not intentionally erased Emily. He had gradually allowed other people to describe her role until even he believed the simplified version. Linda finally spoke. None of this changes ownership. Jonathan nodded. Correct. She looked relieved. Then Jonathan continued. It changes credibility. Her expression tightened again. Charles looked toward Jonathan. Meaning? When courts evaluate contractual intent, Jonathan explained, they also examine conduct. He gestured toward the exhibits covering the table. These records demonstrate that the parties consistently operated according to the original partnership structure. Megan quietly added, the documents reinforce each other. Jonathan smiled. Exactly. No single piece of evidence stood alone. Emails supported meeting minutes. Meeting minutes supported financial records. Financial records supported ownership agreements. Ownership agreements aligned with recorded board discussions. Together, they formed a complete history, one that no longer depended on memory. David looked across the table at Emily. I kept telling everyone you handled operations. Emily answered gently. I did. But that wasn't all. No. Why didn't you correct me? Emily thought for a moment before answering. Would you have listened? David opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The room remained silent, because everyone already knew the answer. Jonathan gathered the exhibits into neat stacks. We've completed the preliminary review. David frowned. Preliminary? Jonathan looked directly at him. There is still one independent verification remaining. Charles Bennett raised an eyebrow. The forensic audit? Jonathan nodded. Requested by the board this morning. Megan quietly closed her binder. If those findings match today's evidence? Jonathan finished the thought. Then every significant fact presented here will have independent financial verification. David lowered his eyes to the contracts once more. For the first time all day, he realized the evidence against his assumptions had not been created after the divorce. It had been accumulating quietly for 12 years. Emily hadn't prepared a case against him. She had simply preserved the truth. And the truth was proving far more difficult to argue with than he had ever imagined. The boardroom emptied in near silence. No one hurried toward the elevators. No one gathered in the hallway to speculate. Even those who had entered the meeting expecting an ordinary corporate separation sensed they had witnessed only the beginning of something much larger. David Carter remained seated long after everyone else had left. Only Jonathan Reed stayed behind. Stacks of certified exhibits still covered the conference table, emails, bank records, board minutes, signed agreements. Nothing dramatic had happened. No one had shouted. No one had threatened legal action. Yet David felt as though the foundation beneath his career had quietly shifted. He stared at one particular email. Emily had written it nearly 8 years earlier. The subject line was simple: cash reserve recommendation before expansion. She had warned that the company's projected cash flow depended too heavily on optimistic sales forecasts. Her recommendation had been straightforward: increase reserves, delay hiring by 60 days, reduce unnecessary executive spending. David remembered dismissing the proposal at first. Then, after discussing it with Emily late one evening, he had approved every recommendation. 6 months later, an unexpected market slowdown struck the industry. Carter Dynamics remained profitable while several competitors announced layoffs. At the time, journalists praised David's disciplined leadership. Very few people knew where the discipline had originated. David closed his eyes. The memory returned with uncomfortable clarity. Emily sitting across from him at the kitchen table, sheets of financial projections spread between empty coffee mugs, patiently explaining every assumption, never insisting, never demanding credit, simply making certain he understood the numbers. Back then, he had trusted her completely. Somewhere along the way, that trust had slowly been replaced by applause. Jonathan quietly organized the remaining files. After several minutes, David finally spoke. "I don't understand how I forgot." Jonathan answered without looking up. "You didn't forget all at once." David remained silent. It happened gradually. Jonathan placed another document into its folder. People rarely rewrite history intentionally. They simplify it. David looked toward him. And eventually, the simplified version becomes the only one they remember. The words lingered. Jonathan continued packing the evidence. "I've seen it happen in family businesses many times. One partner becomes visible. The other becomes assumed. And assumptions eventually replace facts." David rubbed his forehead. "I never wanted to erase Emily." Jonathan finally looked at him. "I believe you." David seemed surprised. "You do?" "Yes." Jonathan closed another folder. But intentions don't change outcomes. Across the building, Megan Collins sat alone in the finance department, reviewing archived accounting records requested by the board's independent forensic auditors. The audit had officially begun less than an hour earlier. Although the board trusted Jonathan's legal analysis, Charles Bennett insisted on complete financial verification. Truth should survive independent review, he had said. No one disagreed. Megan organized 12 years of financial data into chronological order: operating accounts, investment inflows, payroll records, emergency financing, capital contributions. Every transaction required supporting documentation. The process was tedious. It was also revealing. As the hours passed, a clear pattern emerged. Whenever Carter Dynamics faced financial uncertainty during its early years, Emily's personal accounts appeared repeatedly. Short-term operating loans, temporary bridge funding, vendor guarantees, security deposits. Each transfer had been properly documented. Each repayment had eventually been made. Yet almost no one inside the company seemed aware those transactions had ever existed. Megan leaned back in her chair. She whispered to herself, "How did nobody notice?" Then she corrected herself. They noticed. They just forgot. Meanwhile, Emily returned to her office for what might be one of the last times before the divorce proceedings formally concluded. The room looked exactly as it always had. Neatly arranged files, color-coded folders, a small plant near the window, the leather notebook resting beside her keyboard. Nothing reflected the extraordinary events of the morning. She removed another notebook from the cabinet. Its cover displayed a single year. Year 3 inside were handwritten notes from the period when Carter Dynamics nearly collapsed after losing its largest client. She turned to one page. Meeting with David discussed payroll risk. Recommend temporary personal funding. Do not inform staff. Maintain confidence. She remembered that conversation perfectly. David had blamed himself for losing the contract. He had apologized repeatedly. Emily had simply transferred the necessary funds and told him they would solve one problem at a time. She had never mentioned the sacrifice again. Not because it wasn't important, because the company surviving had mattered more than receiving thanks. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. It was Olivia Chen. "I heard the board meeting ended." "It did." Olivia hesitated. "Are you all right?" Emily smiled gently. "I'm tired. Nothing else." Emily looked toward the window. "Mostly tired." Olivia studied her for a moment. "I don't know many people who could stay this calm." Emily closed the notebook. Calm doesn't mean comfortable. The answer surprised Olivia. Emily continued. It simply means deciding not to let emotion make legal decisions. Olivia nodded slowly. "I suppose that's harder." "It usually is." Across town, Linda Carter drove directly to David's apartment. She arrived before he did. By the time David entered, she had already prepared coffee. The silence between them lasted only moments. "This is ridiculous." David loosened his tie. "What is—" "Jonathan. He practically ambushed you." David removed his jacket carefully. "He warned me several times." Linda dismissed the remark. "Warnings don't matter if the paperwork doesn't." David looked toward the city skyline beyond the windows. "I signed it." "So, I signed all of it." Linda crossed her arms. "You were married. People sign things." David answered quietly, "I never read them." Linda refused to accept the implication. Emily probably planned this from the beginning. David turned toward her. "No." The response came faster than he expected. Linda looked surprised. "You believe she didn't?" David remembered the old notebooks, the emails, the board recordings. The years of quiet work no one celebrated. No, he spoke almost to himself. I think she believed we'd always be partners. The room fell silent again. Linda had no reply. Late that evening, Charles Bennett received the first preliminary update from the forensic audit team. It wasn't the final report, only an initial observation. He read the email twice, then once more. The auditors had independently confirmed the authenticity of every major capital contribution identified by Jonathan earlier that day. No discrepancies, no unexplained transfers, no missing records. Everything matched. Charles immediately called Jonathan. I've seen the preliminary findings. Jonathan answered calmly. So have I. They're confirming everything. They've only begun. Charles paused. If the remaining records are equally consistent. Jonathan completed the sentence. Then the historical ownership narrative becomes virtually impossible to dispute. Neither man sounded excited, only relieved. Facts were proving stronger than assumptions. The following morning, the forensic auditors arrived at headquarters. 3 specialists from an independent accounting firm. None had previous relationships with Carter Dynamics. None knew Emily personally. None cared about the divorce. They cared only about evidence. Boxes of archived financial records were delivered to a secure conference room. Megan supervised the transfer. One auditor smiled politely. We'll probably be here all weekend. Megan looked at the towering stacks of documents. I suspected as much. As they began opening the first archival boxes, the lead auditor paused. Who organized these records? Megan answered immediately. Emily Brown. The auditor looked genuinely impressed. They're remarkably complete. Every receipt, every authorization, every supporting note. Chronologically arranged, cross-referenced, digitally indexed. He smiled again. This will save us days. Megan looked toward the hallway where Emily's office stood. She realized something profound. Emily hadn't spent years preparing for a divorce. She had spent years preparing for accountability. There was a difference, a very important one. By Sunday evening, the auditors had verified nearly half the historical financial records. Every major conclusion pointed in the same direction. The company had never been built by one person. It had always rested upon 2 very different kinds of leadership. One inspired people to believe. The other ensured belief survived reality. The audit was not finished. Not yet. But for the first time since the board meeting, David began to understand something far more painful than losing control of a company. He had spent years accepting public praise for achievements that had quietly depended upon someone who never once asked to share the spotlight. And the auditors had only opened half the boxes. Monday morning arrived with an unusual stillness over Carter Dynamics. The building looked no different from any other business day. Employees passed through the lobby carrying coffee cups and laptop bags. Elevators moved steadily between floors. Receptionists greeted visitors with practiced smiles. Yet everyone on the executive floor understood that the company had entered a different chapter. By 9 o'clock, the board of directors assembled once again. Unlike the previous meeting, this session had only one item on the agenda: corporate governance review, independent audit findings, legal determination. Charles Bennett sat at the head of the table. Not because he held more authority than anyone else, because as the lead independent director, it was his responsibility to oversee proceedings whenever matters involved executive leadership. Jonathan Reed arranged several certified binders in front of him. Megan Collins placed the completed forensic audit report beside her laptop. Allison Parker prepared the official minutes. Emily Brown entered quietly and took her usual seat. She carried the same leather notebook, the same pen, the same calm expression. David Carter arrived last. He looked noticeably different. Not defeated, not angry, simply exhausted. He had slept very little over the weekend. Every quiet moment had returned him to memories he had ignored for years. Emily reviewing budgets beside him. Emily staying overnight to prepare investor reports. Emily quietly solving problems before he even recognized they existed. The realization had become impossible to escape. He had not lost sight of her overnight. He had stopped looking little by little. Charles waited until everyone had settled. This meeting is now in session. His voice remained steady. The purpose of today's proceedings is to review the independent audit and determine the company's governance obligations under existing corporate agreements. He looked toward Megan. Please begin. Megan stood. She opened the audit report. Unlike presentations prepared for investors, this document contained no dramatic language, only verified facts. The independent forensic review examined 12 years of financial records. She turned the first page. All original capital contributions have been verified. Another page. Every emergency operating transfer identified by company counsel has been independently confirmed. Another. No evidence of unauthorized ownership changes has been found. She paused briefly. The audit also concludes that all historical financial reporting consistently reflected the ownership structure established under the founding agreements. Silence filled the room. Megan continued. There were no material inconsistencies. She sat down. Charles nodded once. Thank you. He turned toward Jonathan. Counsel. Jonathan stood. He had practiced law long enough to understand that simplicity often carried greater weight than theatrical argument. He addressed the room without raising his voice. The board requested 2 independent questions be answered. He lifted one finger. First, are the founding agreements legally valid? He placed the first legal memorandum on the table. The answer is yes. A second finger. Second, has subsequent corporate conduct reinforced or invalidated those agreements? He placed another memorandum beside the first. The answer is that every significant corporate action has reinforced them. He allowed the words to settle. Not weakened, not replaced, reinforced. David lowered his eyes. Jonathan continued. The evidence supporting this conclusion includes. He began listing them methodically. Original partnership agreements, notarized amendments, board minutes, corporate resolutions, financial records, verified capital contributions, authenticated email correspondence, recorded board meetings, independent forensic accounting. He looked around the room. No single category stands alone. They corroborate one another. Charles asked the next question. Is there any credible legal basis for concluding that Emily Brown ceased being the protected strategic partner established under the founding agreements? Jonathan answered immediately. No. Charles nodded. Thank you. No emotion, only procedure. David finally spoke. His voice sounded quieter than anyone had ever heard during a board meeting. I have a question. Charles looked toward him. Go ahead. David turned to Jonathan. Could I have changed those agreements? Jonathan answered honestly. Yes. David looked surprised. I could have. Yes. When? At any time. David frowned. Then why didn't I? Jonathan's expression remained kind. Because you never asked. The answer struck the room harder than anyone expected. David leaned back slowly. So all these years, Jonathan finished gently, you assumed they said something they never actually said. Another long silence followed. Linda Carter, sitting in the visitors section behind the board table, could no longer remain quiet. This whole discussion ignores reality. Several directors looked toward her. She stood. My son built this company. Charles answered respectfully. No one disputes his work. Then why are we pretending ownership belongs somewhere else? Jonathan spoke calmly. We're not pretending. We're applying signed agreements. Linda shook her head. Emily never acted like an owner. For the first time that morning, Emily spoke without being directly asked. I never believed ownership required announcing itself. Her voice remained soft. I believed it required responsibility. Nothing more. She returned to silence. The room absorbed her words. Charles continued the proceedings. The board has one remaining issue. He opened another folder. Executive leadership. He looked toward Jonathan. Based on the governing agreements, who presently holds the protected strategic authority defined in Section 7, Jonathan answered clearly. Emily Brown. David closed his eyes briefly. He had already known the answer. Hearing it spoken into the official record somehow made it irreversible. Charles continued, does today's execution of the separation agreement alter that conclusion? No. Does it reaffirm it? Yes. Charles nodded once. Thank you. He turned toward the remaining directors. The board will now deliberate. Emily quietly closed her notebook. David remained motionless. Jonathan sat down. No one spoke during the next several minutes. Board members reviewed the audit, compared legal memoranda, examined supporting exhibits. Occasionally, someone asked a brief procedural question. Jonathan answered each one with precise references. Never speculation, always documentation. Finally, Charles looked up. The board has reached its determination. Every person in the room became still. Charles spoke carefully. The board of directors unanimously recognizes the continuing legal validity of the original founding agreements. He turned another page. The board further recognizes that Emily Brown remains the protected strategic partner defined within those agreements. Another page. Corporate governance shall proceed accordingly. David released a slow breath. No protest came, no objection, only acceptance. Not because he liked the outcome, because every document supporting it now rested in front of him. Linda looked horrified. You can't do this, Charles answered gently. We're not creating new rights. We're acknowledging existing ones. She looked desperately toward David. Say something. David remained silent. After several seconds, he finally spoke. Not to the board, not to Jonathan, not even to his mother. He looked directly at Emily. I should have listened. The room stayed perfectly quiet. Emily met his eyes. You listened. David frowned. No. You listened. She spoke with remarkable calm. Many years ago. Another pause. You simply stopped. David lowered his head. There was no defense left, no argument, only truth. Charles allowed the silence to remain before moving to the final agenda item. Executive transition. Jonathan distributed another short memorandum. It outlined the legal procedures necessary to implement the board's decision. There would be no dramatic removal, no public humiliation, no security escort, only structured corporate governance. Exactly the way Emily had always handled every difficult situation, through process, not revenge. As the meeting drew toward its conclusion, Charles looked around the room one final time. In more than 4 decades serving on corporate boards, he paused thoughtfully. I have rarely seen a clearer example of why governance exists. He looked toward David. Vision builds companies. Then toward Emily. Stewardship keeps them alive. No one applauded, no one celebrated, because everyone understood something had ended that morning. Not merely a marriage, not merely a dispute over ownership, an illusion, one that had quietly grown for years until documents finally restored what memory had forgotten. The board meeting ended without applause. There were no victorious smiles, no whispered congratulations. Directors quietly collected their documents and left the room one at a time, each carrying the unmistakable weight of having witnessed a decision that would likely be discussed in business schools for years. Not because it was sensational, but because it demonstrated how corporate governance functioned exactly as it was intended to function. Contracts had prevailed over assumptions. Documentation had prevailed over memory. Procedure had prevailed over emotion. Emily Brown remained seated until the room was nearly empty. She closed her notebook, placed her pen inside the leather cover, and stood. Jonathan Reed approached her. "Do you have a moment?" She nodded. The two walked into the smaller conference room adjoining the boardroom. Jonathan closed the door behind them. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I'm sorry it came to this." Emily offered a faint smile. "So am I." Jonathan studied her expression. "You don't seem relieved." Emily looked through the glass wall toward the now empty boardroom. "I never wanted to win." Jonathan understood immediately. "I know. I wanted us to keep building what we started." For several seconds, neither spoke. Final sigh softly, Jonathan asked, "Are you prepared for what's next?" Emily answered without hesitation. "I'll do what the company needs, not what David deserves." Emily shook her head gently. "Those aren't the same thing." Jonathan smiled. "They never were." Across the hallway, David remained alone in the executive boardroom. The chair at the head of the table suddenly felt unfamiliar. He had occupied it for nearly a decade. Today, for the first time, he questioned whether he had ever truly understood what the position required. He looked around the room. Every object carried memories. The large display screen where he had announced record-breaking revenues, the windows overlooking Elliott Bay, the polished conference table where investors had celebrated major funding rounds. Then another memory surfaced. The very first board meeting. There had been only 4 chairs. No expensive furniture, no media attention. Emily had arrived carrying a cardboard box filled with legal binders. She had smiled and joked that the paperwork weighed more than the company itself. David remembered laughing. He also remembered saying something he had long forgotten. "If we ever become successful enough to argue about ownership, remind me how ridiculous we used to be." He closed his eyes. Emily had never needed to remind him. The documents had done it instead. A quiet knock interrupted his thoughts. It was Charles Bennett. "May I come in?" David nodded. Charles entered without carrying any papers, only a cup of coffee. He placed one cup in front of David. "You look like you could use this." David managed a tired smile. "Probably." Charles sat across from him. For several moments, they simply drank coffee. Finally, David spoke. "Do you think I'm a bad person?" Charles considered the question carefully. "No." David looked surprised. "No. I think you made a series of increasingly poor decisions. There's a difference." David stared into his coffee. "I believed my own reputation." Charles nodded. Many executives do. I stopped noticing the people behind it. Charles remained silent. David continued. I thought recognition proved ownership. Charles leaned back slightly. Recognition proves visibility. Ownership is something else. David laughed bitterly. I know that now. Charles studied him. The important question isn't whether you know it. It's what you'll do with that knowledge. David had no answer. Meanwhile, inside the Human Resources Department, uncertainty spread among employees. Rumors traveled faster than official announcements. Some believed David had resigned. Others insisted Emily had taken over immediately. Several managers privately worried about layoffs. Olivia Chen gathered department heads for a brief meeting. We are not making assumptions. She spoke firmly. Until the board releases an official communication operations, continue normally. One manager raised a hand. Should we prepare for restructuring? Olivia answered honestly. We should prepare to keep doing our jobs. Across the building, Megan Collins finalized the financial transition plan required under the board's determination. Every step had to comply with corporate governance procedures, signature authorities, bank authorization levels, board committee reporting, executive approvals. None of it happened automatically. Everything required precision. As she worked, her phone rang. The caller ID displayed Linda Carter. Megan hesitated before answering. Hello? Linda's voice sounded unusually restrained. I need to ask you something. Go ahead. Did everyone know? Megan understood immediately. No. You didn't know either. I knew Emily had done much more than people realized. Linda took a slow breath. But not this. No. Another pause. Then Linda asked quietly, was my son really warned? Megan closed her eyes for a moment. Several times. Linda whispered, I thought Jonathan was just delaying everything. He wasn't. The call ended politely. Neither woman felt better afterward. Late that afternoon, Linda drove to the small suburban house where Emily's parents had once lived. Emily had inherited the property years earlier, but rarely visited except to maintain it. Linda sat in her car for nearly 10 minutes before finally walking to the front door. She hesitated before knocking. Emily answered herself. Neither woman spoke immediately. I won't stay long, Linda said. Emily stepped aside. Come in. The house felt remarkably simple. Bookshelves, family photographs, fresh flowers near the kitchen window. Nothing reflected the wealth associated with Carter dynamics. Linda looked around quietly. I expected. She stopped. Emily smiled gently. Something bigger? Linda nodded. Emily poured tea into 2 cups. My parents taught me that comfort and size aren't the same thing. They sat across from each other at a wooden dining table. Linda wrapped both hands around the warm cup. I came here because... She struggled to continue. I owe you an apology. Emily remained silent. I judged you. Another pause. I thought you were standing behind David. Emily looked at her calmly. I was. Linda frowned. I don't understand. Emily answered softly. Standing behind someone doesn't mean standing beneath them. The sentence settled heavily between them. Linda lowered her eyes. I kept telling David you weren't important. Emily didn't respond. I was wrong. Still, Emily remained silent. Finally, Linda asked, Can you forgive me? Emily thought for several seconds. Then she answered with characteristic honesty. I don't think forgiveness is something people announce. Linda looked up. I think it's something we practice. There was no accusation, no lecture, only quiet sincerity. Linda nodded slowly. I hope I'll earn that. Emily smiled faintly. So do I. As evening approached, Jonathan Reed met with Allison Parker to prepare the official corporate transition documents. Allison looked up from the draft resolutions. I've never seen anyone handle something like this the way Emily has. Jonathan smiled. Neither have I. No interviews. No public statements. No threats. Jonathan nodded. Because her goal was never to defeat David. It was to protect the company. Allison looked toward the stack of resolutions awaiting execution. I suppose that's why the documents were always so complete. Jonathan closed the final folder. People prepare differently depending on what they're protecting. Outside, the sun slowly disappeared behind the Seattle skyline. For the first time in many days, the rain did not return. Instead, a quiet evening settled over the city. Inside, Carter Dynamics employees continued working writing code, answering clients, solving problems. The company had survived another day, exactly as Emily had always hoped it would. The transition was not yet complete. Several legal procedures still remained. Executive authority had to be formally transferred. Banking institutions needed updated resolutions. Regulatory agencies required official filings. None of it could be rushed. Emily insisted upon that. Not because she doubted the outcome, because procedure mattered most when everyone believed the difficult part was already over. The final chapter would not be written through dramatic speeches. It would be written the same way the company had always been protected. One document at a time. 3 weeks passed before the final legal proceedings were scheduled. During that time, Carter Dynamics continued operating with surprising stability. Projects met their deadlines. Clients noticed no disruption. Employees continued arriving every morning, attending meetings, solving technical problems, and returning home at the end of the day. For many of them, the transition seemed almost invisible. That was exactly how Emily Brown wanted it. She rejected every suggestion that the company issue dramatic press releases or organize public announcements celebrating new leadership. There is nothing to celebrate, she told Jonathan Reed during one planning meeting. He looked at her thoughtfully. Most executives would disagree. Emily closed another folder. This isn't a victory. It's a responsibility. Jonathan nodded. He had expected no other answer. On the morning of the final hearing, Seattle returned to its familiar gray skies. The courthouse stood only a few blocks from the waterfront, its granite steps still damp from the night's rain. Unlike the crowded criminal courtrooms often portrayed in films, the civil proceedings were remarkably quiet. Corporate attorneys, court clerks, a few observers, representatives from the company's board. Everything unfolded with calm efficiency. Emily arrived first. She wore another simple business suit and carried only her leather notebook. Jonathan walked beside her. "Are you ready?" Emily answered honestly. "I've been ready for years." Not because she had anticipated divorce, because she had always believed legal obligations should eventually be honored. David arrived several minutes later. He looked older than he had only a month before. Not physically, emotionally. The confidence that had once filled every room he entered had become something quieter, something more reflective. He noticed Emily speaking briefly with Jonathan near the courtroom entrance. For a moment, he considered walking over. Instead, he remained where he was. Some conversations belonged before a courtroom. Others belonged long before one. At precisely 10 o'clock, the judge entered. The proceedings began. Unlike television dramas, no one delivered passionate speeches. The case had become largely procedural. The evidence had already been examined. The agreements had already been authenticated. The forensic audit had already confirmed every financial record. Today's purpose was simply to formalize what the documents already established. Jonathan presented the final legal summary. He spoke for less than 20 minutes. His presentation followed the same disciplined structure that had guided every previous stage. Founding agreements, supporting amendments, independent financial verification, corporate governance, board determination, current legal status. Every statement referenced certified exhibits. Every conclusion rested upon verified facts. When he finished, the judge reviewed the file silently. Then she looked toward David. "Mr. Carter." David stood. "Do you dispute the authenticity of any document presented before this court?" He answered without hesitation. "No." "Do you dispute your signatures?" "No." "Do you dispute the independent forensic findings?" "No." The judge nodded once. "Thank you." She turned toward Emily. "Mrs. Brown." Emily stood. "Do you request any relief beyond enforcement of the existing agreements?" Emily answered quietly. "No, Your Honor." The judge paused. "No damages?" "No." "No additional claims?" "No." The courtroom remained silent. Even several attorneys exchanged brief glances. Jonathan wasn't surprised. Emily had refused every suggestion that she pursue additional legal remedies. She wanted enforcement, not punishment. The judge continued. "The court appreciates the restraint shown by both parties." She reviewed the final page. "Based upon the evidence submitted." Her voice remained measured. "So, this court recognizes the continued legal validity of the founding partnership agreements." Another page. "The court further recognizes Emily Brown as the protected strategic partner identified therein." She signed the order. "The agreements shall be enforced according to their original terms." A clerk stamped the document. The sound echoed softly through the courtroom. It lasted less than a second. Yet it marked the conclusion of more than a decade of legal preparation. The hearing ended. People quietly gathered their files. There were no dramatic reactions, no reporters rushing toward the doors, only professionals completing their responsibilities. Outside the courthouse, Charles Bennett stood waiting beneath the covered entrance. He approached David first. "I'm sorry things ended this way." David gave a tired smile. "They ended the way they were always written." Charles nodded. "Perhaps." David looked toward the courthouse doors. "No." He shook his head gently. "They ended the way I stopped reading." Charles placed a hand briefly on David's shoulder before walking away. A few moments later, Jonathan joined Emily on the courthouse steps. He handed her a certified copy of the court order. "One copy for your records." Emily accepted it carefully. "I'll file it this afternoon." Jonathan smiled. "I knew you would." She looked at the document for only a moment before placing it inside her portfolio, not because it lacked importance, because she had never measured justice by paperwork alone. Across the street, several employees from Carter Dynamics quietly watched from a distance. None had come to witness conflict. They had come simply because they cared about the future of the company. Megan Collins stood beside Olivia Chen. Olivia spoke first. "I expected today to feel different." Megan nodded. "So did I." "It doesn't." Megan smiled faintly. "That's probably a good sign." As Emily and Jonathan approached, several employees greeted them respectfully. No one applauded. No one cheered. Emily thanked them for coming. Then she addressed the small group. "I know the last few weeks have created uncertainty." Everyone listened. "Our work continues." She looked around at the familiar faces. The company belongs to its mission, not to one person. Several employees nodded. Emily continued. We will honor every commitment we've made. To our clients, to one another, and to the principles on which this company was built. Her remarks lasted less than 2 minutes. There was no attempt to inspire through emotion, only reassurance through clarity. Later that afternoon, the board of directors convened one final time. This meeting contained only a single resolution: executive leadership transition. Charles opened the proceedings. The court has confirmed the legal status previously recognized by this board. He looked toward Emily. The remaining question concerns operational leadership. Jonathan summarized the available options. Emily listened carefully. When he finished, Charles asked, Mrs. Brown, are you willing to serve as interim executive chair while the board conducts a formal CEO selection process? Several directors expected her to accept immediately. Instead, Emily asked a question. What is best for the company's long-term stability? Charles smiled. I was hoping you'd ask that. After a brief discussion, the board unanimously approved a transitional governance structure. Emily would oversee strategic decisions. Day-to-day operations would remain with the existing executive team. Megan Collins would receive expanded financial authority. A national search for the next CEO would begin immediately. The resolution passed unanimously. David watched quietly from the visitors section. He felt no resentment, only understanding. For years, he had believed leadership meant standing in front. Emily had just demonstrated that leadership often meant ensuring everyone else could continue moving forward. As directors prepared to leave, Charles addressed the room one final time. I've spent most of my career investing in businesses. He paused thoughtfully. I've learned that companies survive crises for only one reason. He looked toward Emily. Someone chooses responsibility over pride. No one responded. Nothing more needed to be said. That evening, after everyone else had gone home, Emily walked alone through the executive floor. Lights from the city reflected softly against the windows. She paused outside David's former office. The nameplate had already been removed. She didn't enter. Instead, she continued walking toward her own office. Inside, she unlocked the familiar fireproof cabinet. Carefully, she placed the certified court order beside the original founding agreements. 12 years of documents now rested together once again. The collection was complete. She locked the cabinet, turned off the lights, and quietly closed the office door behind her. The company had finally reached the future those documents had been written to protect. Winter arrived early in Seattle that year. A light frost covered the sidewalks outside Carter Dynamics as employees hurried into the building carrying scarves, steaming coffee cups, and laptops tucked beneath heavy coats. From the outside, nothing suggested that one of the company's most significant transitions had taken place only weeks before. Inside, however, something subtle had changed. The atmosphere felt quieter. Not quieter because people feared speaking. Quieter because uncertainty had disappeared. Emily Brown insisted that the first executive meeting under the new governance structure begin exactly the same way every previous meeting had begun. No speeches, no celebration, no announcement recognizing her new authority. At precisely 8:30, department leaders gathered around the familiar conference table. Megan Collins distributed financial summaries. Olivia Chen presented staffing updates. Engineering directors reviewed project timelines. Emily listened. She spoke only after every department had finished. Thank you. She looked around the room. We have 3 priorities. She raised one finger. Protect our clients. A second. Support our employees. A third. Honor every commitment already made. No one heard the words, my company. No one heard the words, "my leadership." Instead, Emily concluded with a sentence that immediately reshaped the tone of the meeting. "We're not beginning something new. We're continuing something worth protecting." The executives exchanged quiet glances. The meeting moved directly into business. By the end of the first month, employees noticed several changes. Executive bonuses were temporarily reduced. Research funding increased. Employee training programs expanded. Compliance departments received additional resources. Customer support teams hired new staff. No dramatic restructuring occurred. No mass layoffs. No sweeping executive replacements. Managers who had expected revenge found instead a series of practical decisions designed to strengthen the organization. One afternoon, Megan entered Emily's office carrying the quarterly financial projections. "I've compared our revised budget with David's original proposal." Emily looked up from the report she was reviewing. "And we're spending less." Emily nodded. "But investing more." Megan smiled. "Exactly." Emily studied the numbers. Cash reserves, stronger than they've been in 5 years. Research pipeline, fully funded. Employee retention, improving. Emily closed the report. "Good." Megan hesitated. "Can I ask you something?" Emily smiled. "You usually do." Megan laughed softly. "Why didn't you replace the executive team?" Emily leaned back thoughtfully. "Because they didn't break the contracts. They followed the leadership they had." Megan considered the answer. "So you don't blame them?" Emily shook her head. "People deserve to be judged by what they chose, not by who stood above them." The response spread quietly through the executive floor over the following weeks. Managers who had worried about losing their jobs gradually relaxed. Performance improved. Meetings became more collaborative. Departments shared information more freely. Without anyone announcing it, trust slowly returned. Meanwhile, David Carter had begun adjusting to a very different life. He had declined several offers from competitors. He had also refused media interviews requesting his version of the story. Instead, he rented a modest office several miles from downtown Seattle. There was no receptionist, no executive floor, no reserved parking space. Only a desk, a computer, a whiteboard, and silence. For the first time in more than a decade, no one expected him to make decisions affecting hundreds of employees. At first, the quiet felt unbearable. Gradually, it became educational. One afternoon, he opened an old storage box that had remained sealed since the company's earliest years. Inside, he found photographs, business cards, prototype sketches, legal folders. Near the bottom rested a spiral notebook with Emily's handwriting across the cover. Startup ideas. He stared at it for several moments before opening the first page. The notebook contained dozens of lists: potential investors, product improvements, risk assessments, customer feedback. At the bottom of nearly every page appeared one familiar sentence: protect the company before growing it. David closed the notebook slowly. He remembered teasing Emily years ago for writing the same reminder repeatedly. She had smiled and answered, "Growth is exciting. Protection is invisible." Now the sentence carried an entirely different meaning. Across town, Linda Carter visited Carter Dynamics for the first time since the court proceedings. Employees greeted her politely. Without the authority she once believed she possessed, she noticed details she had previously ignored. People smiled when Emily passed through the building, not out of obligation, out of respect. Engineers stopped her to ask questions. Administrative assistants thanked her for approving expanded education benefits. Junior managers sought her advice. She listened more than she spoke. Linda quietly observed from the reception area. Olivia Chen happened to notice her. "Mrs. Carter." Linda smiled awkwardly. "I was just—" She searched for the right words. "Looking around." Olivia nodded. "Emily's upstairs." Linda hesitated. "I don't want to interrupt." "I don't think she'd mind." Several minutes later, Linda knocked gently on Emily's office door. Emily looked up. "Come in." Linda entered carrying a small cardboard box. "I found these." She placed the box on the desk. Inside rested old photographs from the company's earliest days. Pictures of the original office, the first employee picnic, the first successful software launch. Emily smiled softly. "I thought these were lost. I found them in David's storage unit." Emily carefully lifted one photograph. It showed her and David assembling office desks late at night. Both were laughing. Neither looked tired, despite the obvious exhaustion visible on their faces. Linda looked at the picture. "He loved you?" Emily nodded gently. "I know." Linda's eyes filled slightly. "I think he forgot how to show it." Emily remained silent. Linda continued. "And I helped him forget." The room grew quiet. Finally, Emily spoke. "We all influence the people we love." Linda looked down. "I influenced him badly." Emily placed the photograph back into the box. "What matters now is what happens next." Linda nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about that." She took a deep breath. "I'd like to apologize publicly." Emily looked surprised. "Why?" "So people know I was wrong." Emily considered the idea. Then she smiled kindly. "I don't think the employees need another speech." Linda frowned. "No." Emily shook her head. "They've already seen your actions changing. Keep changing. The rest will follow." Linda smiled through moist eyes. "You always make things simpler." Emily laughed quietly. "No. I usually make them slower." Both women smiled. For the first time in years, there was no hostility between them. Only honesty. Later that week, Charles Bennett visited headquarters to review quarterly governance reports. He met Emily in the executive conference room. "I've looked through the latest numbers." Emily waited. "They're excellent." She nodded politely. "Our teams deserve the credit." Charles smiled. "I expected that answer." He looked around the room. "You know, several directors asked whether you'd accept the permanent CEO position." Emily remained thoughtful. "I've decided not to." Charles wasn't surprised. "May I ask why?" Emily walked toward the windows, overlooking Elliott Bay. "My strengths aren't in public leadership." "They never have been." Charles joined her near the glass. "You understand something many executives never do." Emily looked toward the harbor. "What's that?" "Leadership isn't choosing the biggest chair, it's choosing the right one." A few weeks later, the board unanimously appointed an experienced external executive as the company's new CEO. The announcement attracted moderate media attention. Reporters expected controversy. They found none. Emily remained executive chair overseeing governance and long-term strategy. The new CEO managed daily operations. The transition proved remarkably smooth. One journalist later described it as the least dramatic executive succession in recent corporate history. Emily smiled when she read the article. She hoped that would always remain true, because businesses should become famous for serving customers, not for surviving internal conflict. On a quiet Friday evening, after most employees had gone home, Emily walked through the nearly empty headquarters one final time before the holiday break. Departments buzzed softly with cleaning crews preparing for the weekend. She paused briefly in the lobby. The company logo reflected against the polished marble floor. Years earlier, she and David had chosen that design together. She remembered the excitement, the hope, the certainty that they would build everything side by side. Life had taken another path. But the company still stood. Not because one person had won, because the principles they once created together had endured long enough to protect it. Emily smiled gently. Then she turned off the final conference room light and walked toward the elevator, leaving the building exactly as she had always hoped to leave every difficult day, quietly, with dignity. Spring returned to Seattle almost unnoticed. The heavy clouds that had dominated the winter gradually gave way to longer afternoons and clear reflections across Elliott Bay. Cherry blossoms lined several downtown streets, adding quiet color to a city that had witnessed the rise and near collapse of one remarkable partnership. 6 months had passed since the court's final order. For Carter, Dynamics' life had settled into a new rhythm. Clients remained confident. Investors stayed committed. Employee turnover reached its lowest level in nearly 7 years. The independent CEO appointed by the board had earned the respect of the staff by focusing on execution rather than personal recognition. Emily Brown attended every monthly board meeting. She still carried the same leather notebook. She still arrived early. She still sat near the end of the conference table rather than at its head whenever protocol allowed. Nothing about her routine suggested someone who now possessed authority recognized by both the court and the board. To Emily, authority had never been something to display. It was something to exercise carefully. One Tuesday morning, Charles Bennett reviewed the company's annual governance report before addressing the board. "I've served on corporate boards for 43 years. The room grew quiet. "I've rarely signed a report with fewer unresolved governance issues than this one." He closed the folder. "Our internal controls are stronger. Our compliance standards have improved. Our employee retention continues to rise." He smiled toward Megan Collins. "The finance department deserves recognition." Megan smiled politely. "So does every department." Charles nodded. "Exactly." The company had stopped revolving around one personality. It had become an institution again. After the meeting ended, Emily remained behind to organize her notes. The new CEO approached her. "I wanted to thank you." Emily looked up. "For what?" "You've never once tried to manage my job." Emily smiled gently. "You were hired to do it." He laughed. "Many executive chairs struggle with that." Emily closed her notebook. "My responsibility is making sure the company succeeds, not making sure everyone notices me succeeding." The CEO shook his head with admiration. "I've learned more from watching you in 6 months than I did from some executives in 10 years. Emily simply thanked him. Praise had never made her uncomfortable. She just refused to live for it. Across the city, David Carter had begun teaching entrepreneurship at a local university as a guest lecturer. When the invitation first arrived, he almost declined. He questioned whether he had anything worthwhile to teach anymore. Eventually, he accepted, not because he considered himself an expert, because he believed students deserved honesty. On the final lecture of the semester, one student asked a question that caught him completely off guard. "If you could change one decision from your career," the student asked, "what would it be?" The classroom fell silent. David thought for several moments. Finally, he answered, "I would pay more attention to the people whose work wasn't visible." Several students waited for him to elaborate. He continued, "When success arrives, it becomes very easy to confuse recognition with contribution." He smiled sadly. "The two are rarely the same." No one in the classroom knew the entire story. They didn't need to. The lesson stood on its own. After class, David walked slowly across campus carrying only a worn leather briefcase. Inside rested a single notebook, Emily's old startup notebook. She had returned it to him several months earlier after discovering it among archived company materials. Inside the cover, she had written one additional sentence. "Take care of whatever you build next. Nothing else? No signature? No farewell? Only encouragement." He had read those words dozens of times. They never became less meaningful. One Saturday afternoon, Emily visited the small suburban house she had inherited from her parents. The garden had begun blooming again. She spent several quiet hours planting flowers and trimming hedges. No phone calls, no meetings, no legal documents, only ordinary work. As she carried a watering can across the yard, a familiar car stopped along the curb. David stepped out. He remained beside the gate instead of walking toward her. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Emily smiled politely. "You aren't." She set the watering can down. For a few moments, they simply stood beneath the warm afternoon sun. Finally, David spoke. "I've been meaning to return something." He held out a small wooden frame. Emily accepted it. Inside was a photograph from their very first day in the tiny office above the coffee shop. The old mismatched desks, the second-hand chairs, the handwritten company name taped to the wall, both of them laughing. David looked at the photograph. "I kept this on my desk for years." Emily smiled softly. "I remember. I stopped seeing it." She looked at him. "I know." David took a slow breath. "I've apologized before." "You have?" "I don't expect anything." Emily nodded. "I know." Another quiet pause followed. Then David asked the question he had carried for months. "Were you ever angry?" Emily considered the question carefully. "Yes." David lowered his eyes. "I thought so. But not for the reason you probably imagine." He looked back up. "I wasn't angry because you forgot what I contributed. I was angry because you forgot who we used to be." The words carried no bitterness, only sadness. David nodded slowly. "I did." Emily smiled gently. "But remembering is how people begin changing." Neither spoke for a while. Birds chirped somewhere beyond the trees. A light breeze moved through the garden. Eventually, David looked toward the flowers she had been planting. "You always liked growing things." Emily laughed quietly. "So did you." "I suppose I forgot that too." He glanced toward the house. "I won't keep you." He turned to leave. After several steps, he stopped. Without looking back, he said, "Thank you." Emily answered simply, "Take care, David." He nodded once and walked back toward his car. She watched until it disappeared around the corner. Then she looked again at the framed photograph. It represented a beginning, not an ending. She carried it inside the house and placed it on a bookshelf beside photographs of her parents, not because she wished to return to the past, because she had finally made peace with it. Months later, Carter Dynamics celebrated its 15th anniversary. There was no lavish gala, no extravagant production. Instead, the company organized a volunteer day supporting local schools that needed updated computer laboratories. Employees assembled desks, installed software, painted classrooms. Emily spent the morning helping students connect their first laptops. One little girl looked up at her and asked, "Are you the boss?" Emily smiled. "I'm part of a very good team." The child grinned. "My teacher says the best teams help everyone." Emily nodded. "Your teacher sounds very wise." As the afternoon sun settled over Seattle, Charles Bennett watched employees laughing while carrying boxes of donated equipment into another classroom. Jonathan Reed stood beside him. Charles smiled. You know. Jonathan looked at him. The company survived exactly the way it was designed to survive. Jonathan nodded. Because someone respected the agreements. Charles glanced across the schoolyard, where Emily patiently showed a group of children how to start their computers. No, he smiled, because someone respected the responsibility behind them. Jonathan followed his gaze. I think you're right. The story that had begun with signatures ended not with victory, but with understanding. David had lost a title. Emily had gained recognition she never sought. Neither outcome mattered as much as the lesson left behind. Power could impress people. Documentation could protect companies. But character revealed itself only when no applause remained. When stories like this end, they rarely stay inside the courtroom or the boardroom where the final documents are signed. They follow us into ordinary moments, into the conversations we have with family, the promises we make to those who trust us, and the quiet decisions no one else ever sees. Emily never won because she was louder, wealthier, or more determined to humiliate someone who had hurt her. She prevailed because she respected truth long before she needed it. She understood that integrity is built one decision at a time, often without witnesses, and that justice is strongest when it arrives through patience rather than revenge. David's greatest loss was never his position or his authority. It was realizing too late that the person he had stopped noticing had been protecting both his dream and his future all along. His greatest lesson came only after success had stripped away certainty and left him with honesty. If this story stayed with you, I'd love to hear where you're watching from. And what part of Emily's journey resonated most with you? Your thoughts often become the beginning of meaningful conversations between viewers around the world. And if you enjoy thoughtful stories about resilience, integrity, and justice quietly finding their way to the surface, consider liking this video and subscribing. There will always be another story waiting, one that reminds us that dignity is often the strongest answer of all.